In the year 2038, the world still looked mostly normal, at least from a distance. Cars still moved through cities, people still went to work, kids still played in parks. But beneath that surface, everything was quietly falling apart. The oceans were heating up faster than anyone had predicted. Ice in Greenland and Antarctica wasn't just melting. It was collapsing in huge, unstoppable chunks. Weather had become unpredictable in ways that scared even the most seasoned meteorologists. One week it would pour rain for days in places that hadn't seen a drop in years. The next, wildfires would swallow entire towns in dry, choking smoke. Deep in a secure underground facility beneath the Swiss Alps, a group of people gathered for what they knew might be their last real chance to change things. They called themselves the Intergovernmental Council on Planetary Stability, though most just called it the Council. These weren't politicians or celebrities. They were scientists, engineers, public health experts, and a few retired diplomats who'd spent decades watching the warning signs grow louder and more urgent. They weren't there to argue or debate. They were there because the data had finally spoken in a voice too clear to ignore. One woman, a climatologist who'd spent her whole career tracking ice sheets and ocean currents, stood at the front of the room. She didn't need fancy charts or dramatic music. She just showed them the numbers. The numbers said that within 5 years, large parts of the planet would become too hot, too dry, or too flooded for people to live there safely. Not just uncomfortable, unlivable. Crops would fail on a global scale. Fresh water would vanish in many regions. Millions would be forced to move, and there wouldn't be enough space or resources to take them in. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just said calmly, "If we don't act now, right now, we won't get another chance." The room was silent for a long time. Some members stared at their hands. Others looked at the floor. A few exchanged glances that said everything. "We've been saying this for 20 years. Then came the hard part. The council drafted an emergency plan, not just to cut emissions or plant trees, those things were still important, but they wouldn't be enough anymore. This plan was about survival. It included immediate food stockpiling, rapid development of drought-resistant crops, mass relocation strategies for coastal populations, and, most controversially, preparations for controlled, orderly off-world evacuation using existing space infrastructure. It wasn't science fiction. Lunar bases had been operational for over a decade, and Mars habitats were already testing closed-loop life support systems. The technology existed. What was missing was the will. The report was sent to every major government, every head of state, every relevant international body. Within days, the responses started coming back, not in person, not with urgency, but through formal letters and press statements. One leader called the projections overly pessimistic. Another said his country couldn't afford to panic when the economy was still recovering from the last crisis. A third dismissed the whole thing as elite fear-mongering, claiming ordinary people just wanted to get back to normal life. The truth was, no one wanted to hear it. After decades of warnings about pollution, about warming, about inequality, people had grown numb. Politicians feared losing votes if they asked citizens to sacrifice comfort for survival. Businesses worried about profits. And most everyday folks? They were tired. Tired of bad news, tired of feeling guilty, tired of being told the world was ending while they struggled to pay rent or feed their families. So they looked away. And the leaders, sensing that exhaustion, looked away too. Back in the bunker, the council watched the responses roll in. There were no angry outbursts, no dramatic resignations, just a quiet, heavy sadness. They'd done their job. They'd sounded the alarm as clearly and honestly as they could. But sounding the alarm only works if someone is willing to listen. One evening, after the last video conference ended, a few members stayed behind in the dimly lit operations room. Outside, snow fell gently over the mountains, peaceful, almost serene. Inside, the air felt thick with regret. One of them, an older man who'd helped design early climate models in the 1990s, poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to the climatologist. "Do you think they'll come around?" he asked. She stared at the steam rising from her cup. "Not in time," she said softly. "They'll believe it when it's standing in their living room. But by then, it'll be too late to fix." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of servers and ventilation systems, the quiet heartbeat of a world trying to hold itself together while the ground beneath it cracked open. The council didn't give up that day. They kept working, kept refining their models, kept sending updates. But something had shifted. The urgency was still there, but the hope, the belief that humanity might actually come together in time, had begun to fade. They weren't just preparing for disaster anymore. They were preparing for aftermath, and as the weeks turned into months, the signs grew harder to ignore even for those who tried. Record-breaking heat waves shut down power grids. Entire fishing industries collapsed as ocean ecosystems died. Refugees from drowned islands and burned-out farmlands gathered at borders that were quickly being sealed shut. Still, the big decisions didn't come. The global coordination never happened. Instead, countries turned inward, building walls, both real and political, while the planet quietly slipped past the point of no return. The Council watched it all unfold on their screens, helpless not because they lacked knowledge, but because they lacked power. They could see the cliff ahead, but they couldn't stop the car from speeding toward it. All they could do was brace for impact and start planning for what came after. And so, in that cold, quiet bunker beneath the mountains, the first real conversations about leaving Earth began, not as a dream but as a last resort. Not because they wanted to abandon their home, but because staying might mean extinction. The irony wasn't lost on them. Humans had reached the stars, built wonders of technology and art, connected across continents in seconds, yet couldn't find the collective will to save the only world they'd ever known. It wasn't anger that filled them now. It was grief. Grief for what could have been. Grief for the future that was slipping away, not with a bang but with a long, slow sigh of indifference. And as the year 2038 drew to a close, the Council made a quiet decision. If the world wouldn't listen, they would at least make sure someone survived to remember why it fell apart. Not for glory, not for blame, but so that somewhere out there among the stars, the story of Earth wouldn't end with silence. By 2041, the world didn't just feel broken, it looked broken. What had once been slow creeping changes now hit like waves, one after another, faster than anyone could recover. Coastal cities that had stood for centuries were half submerged. Streets once filled with traffic and street vendors were now canals of murky, salty water. People didn't just lose homes. They lost entire neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, the places where generations had lived, loved, and buried their dead. And there was no rebuilding. Not really, because just as soon as someone tried to patch things up, another storm would come, bigger and angrier than the last. The Council, still operating from their underground base, watched it all unfold on live feeds and emergency broadcasts. They weren't surprised. Everything happening was exactly what their models had predicted. But seeing it in real time was different. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a grandmother wading through chest-deep water, clutching a photo album. It was a child sitting alone on a rooftop, waiting for a rescue boat that never came. It was entire towns voting to relocate inland, only to be turned away at borders that had once been open. Governments, once slow to act, were now scrambling, but in the wrong ways. Instead of working together, they turned on each other. Countries that used to trade food and medicine now hoarded what little they had left. Some built massive walls along rivers and coastlines, not to keep out water but to keep out people. Others shut down their borders completely, declaring states of emergency that never ended. The idea of global cooperation that the Council had once pinned their hopes on? It vanished like morning fog. Inside the bunker, the mood had changed. There were no more hopeful meetings about saving the planet. Now the conversations were practical, even grim. How many people can we realistically move? Which regions still have stable soil for emergency farming? Can we retrofit old cargo ships for long-term space travel? The dream of fixing Earth was fading. In its place was a new, quieter mission, saving as many lives as possible before it was too late. They called it Project Exodus, but no one used that name out loud. It felt too final, too biblical. Instead, they referred to it in code, Phase 2, the contingency, or just the plan. The truth was they didn't have enough ships, not nearly enough. The lunar bases and Mars outposts had been built for research, not mass migration. But they were the only options left. So the Council started quietly reaching out, to space agencies, to private aerospace companies, even to retired engineers who'd worked on early shuttle programs. They asked for help, not with promises of money, but with a simple question. If you could save a few thousand people, would you try? Some said yes. Not out of heroism, but because they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't. Meanwhile, on the surface, society was unraveling in ways no one had expected. It wasn't just about hunger or heat. It was about trust. People stopped believing in institutions, governments, news outlets, even scientists. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. The floods are fake. The heat is just a natural cycle. They're using climate fear to control us. In some places, crowds stormed emergency supply depots not because they were evil, but because they were desperate and had been told again and again that no one was coming to help them. The council saw this too. They knew that fear and misinformation were now as dangerous as the rising seas. But what could they do? They weren't in charge. They had no army, no media empire, no way to reach the millions who needed to hear the truth. All they had were facts, and facts, it turned out, weren't enough when people were scared and tired. Still, small acts of courage kept flickering. In a flooded village in Southeast Asia, a teacher turned her school roof into a floating classroom, teaching kids math and history between rescue boat arrivals. In a drought-stricken region of Africa, farmers shared the last of their seeds knowing they might not live to see the next harvest, but hoping someone else would. In Europe, volunteers opened their homes to climate refugees, even as their own governments threatened fines or jail time. These stories gave the council a strange kind of hope. Not that Earth could be saved, but that humanity at its core hadn't completely lost its heart. But time was running out. By mid-2041, the first major food shortages hit hard. Wheat, rice, and corn yields dropped by over 40% in a single growing season. Supermarkets emptied. Governments rationed. Black markets for canned goods and bottled water sprang up overnight. In cities, people lined up for hours just to get a loaf of bread. And in the countryside, entire communities packed up what little they had and walked, sometimes for weeks, toward rumored safe zones that often didn't exist. The council made a painful choice. They would prioritize who got a chance to leave Earth, not based on wealth or fame, but on skills. Doctors, engineers, teachers, geneticists, water purifiers, seed keepers, people who could help rebuild somewhere else. It felt cruel, like playing God, but they had no other option. There simply wasn't room for everyone. They began compiling lists in secret using encrypted channels. Families would be kept together when possible. Children would be given priority. No one would be chosen for their past, only for what they could offer the future. Outside, the world kept burning. Literally, in some places, wildfires raged across continents, turning skies orange even at noon. Smoke drifted so far it darkened cities thousands of miles away. Breathing became a luxury. Masks, once used only in hospitals, were now everyday wear, even for toddlers. And through it all, the council watched. Not as judges, not as saviors, but as witnesses. They recorded everything. The failures, the courage, the quiet dignity of people helping strangers in the dark. They saved voice messages, photos, journal entries, anything that showed what it meant to be human in the final years of a dying world. They knew history would judge them. Maybe harshly, but they also knew this: they had tried. Not perfectly, not loudly, but steadily. And when the last ship finally lifted off, carrying the last hope of their species, they wanted to be able to say they did everything they could, with honesty, with care, and without giving up on each other, even when the world above had. The fractures were everywhere now, in the land, in the systems, in the hearts of people. But deep underground, in a quiet room lit only by screens and resolve, a small group of humans held on to one fragile truth. Even if Earth couldn't be fixed, the story didn't have to end here. Not yet. Not while there was still breath and still a way forward, however distant, however uncertain. By early 2044, the word evacuation had stopped sounding like science fiction and started sounding like the only thing left that made sense. It wasn't announced with fanfare or parades. There were no grand speeches broadcast to the world. Instead, it began quietly, through encrypted messages, late-night calls, and secret meetings in abandoned warehouses and decommissioned airports. The plan was no longer just a theory tucked away in a bunker. It was happening. And it was happening fast. The first ships weren't sleek, futuristic vessels from movies. They were old cargo haulers, repurposed lunar supply shuttles, and even modified deep space mining rigs. Machines never meant to carry people, let alone families. But they were what was available. Engineers worked around the clock, welding extra life support pods onto hulls. installing emergency oxygen recyclers and testing every bolt and wire like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The people chosen to go weren't celebrities or billionaires. They were mechanics who could fix anything with a wrench, doctors who'd worked in war zones and refugee camps, botanists who knew how to grow food in dust, teachers who could explain complex ideas with patience and care. Each one had been vetted not for who they were, but for what they could help rebuild. And every single one had left someone behind, a parent, a sibling, a best friend, because there simply wasn't room for everyone. Launch sites became places of heartbreaking goodbyes. At a former spaceport in Kazakhstan, now surrounded by cracked earth and dried-up rivers, a young woman hugged her younger brother for what she knew was the last time. She whispered, "Be brave." And he nodded, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't cry out. He just held her hand until the guards gently pulled them apart. At another site in Chile, an elderly man handed his granddaughter a small wooden bird he'd carved years ago. "Keep it safe," he said. "And tell stories about Earth. Don't let them forget." The council coordinated it all from their underground command center, their voices calm over comms even as their hands shook. They weren't in charge of the launches. They never had that kind of power. But they were the quiet backbone, matching skills to needs, rerouting ships when storms hit, calming panicked families over secure lines. They didn't wear uniforms or carry titles anymore. They were just people trying to do the right thing in a world that had run out of second chances. But not everyone accepted the plan. As news of the evacuations leaked, through rumors, hacked files, or desperate social media posts, chaos erupted. Crowds gathered outside launch zones, not with weapons, but with hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a seat left for them. Some brought children in their arms. Others carried medical records, diplomas, letters of recommendation, as if proof of being useful might earn them a spot on a ship that was already full. Security teams, made up of volunteers and former peacekeepers, stood at the gates. They didn't carry guns. They carried lists and heavy hearts. Every no they gave felt like a personal failure. One guard later wrote in his journal, "I turned away a nurse today. She'd saved hundreds during the fever outbreaks. But we only had room for 2 more medics and they were already assigned." She didn't yell. She just nodded and walked away. "I'll see her face every night for the rest of my life." Black markets exploded overnight. Fake boarding passes, forged skill certifications, even rumors of private seats sold for gold, data chips, or rare antibiotics. The council knew about it, but they couldn't stop it. They focused instead on protecting the integrity of the mission, making sure the people who got on those ships could actually help build a future, not just survive the trip. The first successful launch happened on a cold, clear morning in March. The ship, retrofitted from an old asteroid freighter, lifted slowly into the sky, trailing fire and hope. Inside, 247 people sat strapped into seats that had once held machinery. Some prayed, some cried silently. Others stared out the small, reinforced windows, watching the only home they'd ever known shrink below them. Green patches, gray cities, blue rivers, all fading into a single, fragile marble. From orbit, the view was both beautiful and devastating. Earth still glowed with life, but the scars were visible now. Brown patches where forests used to be, swirling storms that never broke, coastlines blurred by endless flooding. The passengers didn't cheer. They were too tired, too sad. But they held hands. They shared water. They whispered promises to each other. "We'll remember. We'll try again. We won't make the same mistakes." Back on the ground, the world kept turning, but slower, heavier. With each launch, a little more light went out of the cities. Power grids failed in sections and weren't repaired. Hospitals ran on generators until the fuel ran out. Schools closed, not for summer break, but forever. Yet even in the collapse, kindness persisted. Neighbors shared food. Strangers carried each other's elderly to higher ground. Artists painted murals on crumbling walls. Oceans, trees, children laughing. Images of a world they hoped someone, somewhere, would one day live in again. The council, now down to a skeleton crew, prepared for their own departure. They packed not just data drives and survival kits, but boxes of handwritten letters, children's drawings, recordings of birdsong and rainfall, recipes passed down for generations. They knew these things wouldn't feed anyone on Mars or the Moon, but they believed something deeper, that to be human wasn't just about surviving. It was about remembering what made life worth living. As the third and final wave of ships prepared to leave, a strange calm settled over the launch zones. The crowds had thinned. The shouting had stopped. Those left behind weren't angry anymore. They were resigned, but also proud. They had helped load supplies. They had guarded the perimeter. They had given their last clean water to a child boarding a ship. In their own way, they were part of the mission too. One evening, as the last transport hummed with pre-launch checks, an old woman sat on a folding chair near the tarmac, knitting. Someone asked her why she wasn't trying to get on. She smiled softly and said, "My time is here, but theirs doesn't have to end. Let them go. Let them try." The engines roared to life. The ground trembled. And as the ship rose into the darkening sky, thousands on the ground looked up, not with envy, but with quiet blessing. The council watched from their bunker one last time. Their work was done. Earth hadn't been saved. But humanity, fragile, flawed, and fiercely loving, wasn't finished yet. And sometimes that was enough. By 2047, Earth had gone quiet, not all at once, but slowly, like a song fading out at the end of a record. The constant hum of traffic, the buzz of city lights, the chatter of crowded markets, those sounds were gone. In their place was wind, rain, and the occasional distant crack of a building giving way under the weight of time and weather. Nature wasn't taking over in a dramatic movie-like way. It was simply filling the spaces humans had left behind. Vines crept up abandoned apartment blocks. Wildflowers pushed through cracked sidewalks. Deer wandered through empty parking lots unafraid. From their orbital station, nicknamed Ethel, an old word meaning noble or honorable, the last members of the council watched it all through high-resolution lenses and satellite feeds. They weren't tourists. They weren't scientists collecting data anymore. They were mourners. Every day, someone would float over to the observation deck, press their forehead against the cool glass, and just stare at the blue and green swirl below. No one spoke much during those moments. Words felt too small for what they were feeling. Life aboard Ethel was quiet, orderly, and strangely peaceful. Food was grown in vertical gardens under LED lights. Water was recycled endlessly. Everyone had a role, maintaining systems, tending crops, teaching the few children who'd made it off Earth. But beneath the routine, there was a deep, unspoken grief. They weren't just missing their homes. They were missing the idea of home, the smell of rain on hot pavement, the sound of a neighbor's laugh through an open window, the feeling of soil between your fingers. Things you never think to appreciate until they're gone forever. One of the council members, a former diplomat who'd spent decades negotiating peace deals and climate accords, had started a project no one had asked for but everyone needed. He called it the Memory Archive. It wasn't fancy, just a digital library filled with songs, poems, home videos, recipes, old radio broadcasts, even grocery lists and birthday cards. Anything that showed what everyday life had really been like. Not the wars or disasters, but the small ordinary moments that made being human beautiful. He'd spend hours listening to a recording of a street musician playing guitar in a subway station, or watching a shaky phone video of a toddler taking their first steps in a sunlit kitchen. Sometimes he'd cry, not from sadness, but from gratitude that these things had existed at all. Others joined in. A botanist uploaded recordings of birds she used to hear every morning from her balcony. An engineer shared blueprints of his childhood treehouse, scribbled in pencil on yellowed paper. A teacher added lesson plans she'd used for decades, filled with doodles in the margins and notes like, "Maria finally understood fractions today." The archive wasn't meant for history books. It was meant for the future, for the children growing up on Mars or the Moon who would only know Earth as a story. The council wanted them to understand that humanity wasn't just about survival or technology. It was about lullabies, shared meals, handwritten letters, and the way people would help strangers during a blackout, just because it was the right thing to do. But not everything was gentle. Some days, the silence from Earth was unbearable. They'd pick up faint emergency signals, old beacons still pinging into the void, long after anyone was left to answer them. Or they'd see smoke rising from a region that had been stable just months before. Each time they'd hold their breath hoping it was just a wildfire, and not something worse. They knew a few small groups had chosen to stay behind, not out of denial but out of love. Some were too old to survive the journey. Others refused to leave sacred lands or ancestral homes. A few simply believed that if humanity was going to end, someone should be there to witness it with dignity. The council respected that. They never judged. They just hoped those who stayed found peace in their final days. One evening, during a rare moment of calm, the group gathered in the common area. Someone had managed to bake bread using yeast cultures saved from Earth, real bread with a crust that crackled when you broke it. They shared it slowly, savoring every bite as if it were a sacrament. No one talked about the past or the future. They just sat together, eating, breathing, being present. Later, someone asked, "Do you think anyone will ever go back?" There was a long pause. Finally, another replied, "Maybe, not in our lifetime. But someday, when the air clears, when the oceans heal, Earth isn't dead. It's resting." That idea, that Earth was only sleeping, became a kind of quiet faith aboard Ethel. They didn't pray to gods, but they held on to hope like a lifeline. Hope that the planet they'd failed could one day forgive them. Hope that the seeds they'd saved, both literal and metaphorical, would take root somewhere new. They also debated whether to send one final message down to the empty surface. Not a warning, not an apology, just a simple note. "We were here, we tried. We're sorry," but they never agreed on the words. How do you sum up billions of lives, thousands of years of joy and struggle in a single sentence? In the end, they decided silence might be the most honest tribute. So they watched, and remembered, and kept the lights on aboard Ethel, not just for survival, but as a tiny beacon in the dark, a reminder that even when a world falls silent, the people who loved it never truly let go. Sometimes, late at night, when the station was quiet and the stars outside seemed endless, one of them would whisper to the void, "Good night, Earth." And though no one answered, it felt right to say it, because love doesn't end just because the person or the planet you love is gone. It just changes shape, and from 250 miles above the clouds, that love was all they had left. The day the last ship left orbit, the sky didn't crack open. There was no thunder, no final trumpet call, just the soft hiss of airlocks sealing, the low hum of engines warming up, and the quiet breathing of 800 souls who carried the weight of an entire species in their hearts. The ship was called Voyager's Resolve, not because they were certain of success, but because they refused to give up, even now. Inside, it felt less like a spaceship and more like a floating village. Tiny cabins lined the corridors, each one holding a family, a pair of friends or a lone survivor who'd lost everyone but still chose to go. The walls were covered in photos, drawings, and notes, reminders of who they were and what they'd left behind. In the common area, children played with handmade toys, their laughter echoing softly in the recycled air. It was strange, almost surreal, to hear joy in a place built for survival. As the ship pulled away from the orbital station, those aboard gathered in the observation deck. No one had ordered them to. They just drifted there, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. Through the thick glass, Earth hung in the blackness, smaller now, softer, wrapped in swirls of white cloud and deep blue ocean. It looked peaceful. Beautiful even, nothing like the chaos they'd fled. From up here you couldn't see the flooded cities or the scorched fields. You couldn't hear the silence where voices used to be. All you saw was a world that had once held everything. No one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because words would have broken the moment. Some held hands. Others pressed palms to the glass as if trying to touch home one last time. A few cried quietly, tears floating in slow beads in the low gravity. But there was no panic, no regret, not in that moment. Only reverence. They weren't running away. They were carrying something forward. Back on the station, the few who stayed behind, too old, too sick, or simply too tied to Earth to leave, watched the ship shrink into a bright dot against the stars. They didn't wave. They just stood together in silence, arms around each other until it vanished completely. Then they turned off the main lights, leaving only the emergency strips glowing faintly along the floor. Their work was done. Now they would wait. Not for rescue, there would be none, but for the quiet end, on their own terms, in the place they loved. Aboard Voyager's Resolve, life quickly settled into a new rhythm. Days were marked not by sunrises, but by shift bells and mealtimes. People took turns tending the hydroponic gardens, checking oxygen levels, teaching lessons to the children, or simply sitting with someone who needed company. There were no leaders anymore, not really. Just people helping people. The old titles, scientist, diplomat, engineer, meant less now. What mattered was whether you could fix a leak, comfort a scared child, or share your last piece of chocolate. The destination was Proxima Centauri b, a planet orbiting the closest star to our sun. It wasn't perfect, cold with a thin atmosphere, but decades of robotic missions had prepared it. Domes were already built. Water had been extracted from ice. Seeds slept in vaults waiting for human hands to plant them. It wasn't Earth, it never would be, but it was a chance. As the weeks turned into months, the crew began to heal, not all at once, but in small ways. A woman who hadn't spoken since losing her family started humming old songs while she worked. A teenager who'd spent the last year angry at the world began teaching younger kids how to grow lettuce in zero gravity. Even the oldest among them, who rarely left their cabin, started joining meals, sharing stories of markets, festivals, and summer nights under open skies. They also kept the memory archive alive. Every evening, someone would play a recording. A street performer's violin, a grandmother's recipe for soup, the sound of rain on a tin roof. The children listened wide-eyed, as if hearing fairy tales. But the adults knew better. These weren't stories. They were instructions on how to be human. One night, as the ship coasted through the silent dark between stars, the ship's AI, calm, neutral, built for logic, logged an observation in its internal record. Humanity has left its cradle. Cause of departure, self-inflicted systemic failure. Probability of recurrence, 87.3%. The words were cold, clinical. But the humans aboard didn't live by probabilities. They lived by choice. And every day they chose to be kind, to listen, to plant seeds even when they might never see them grow. Years would pass before they reached their new home. Years of waiting, working, grieving, and slowly, gently rebuilding trust, not just in each other, but in the idea that they deserved a second chance. They knew they carried the mistakes of the past with them, but they also carried something else, the quiet determination to do better. As Voyager's Resolve sailed deeper into the unknown, Earth became just a pale dot in the rear sensors, then nothing at all. But it wasn't forgotten. In every lesson taught, every seed planted, every hand held in the dark, Earth lived on, not as a warning, but as a whisper. Remember what you lost. Now build something worth keeping. And out there among the stars, with no fanfare and no guarantees, humanity began again, not with a bang, but with a breath. A shared meal, a child's question, a promise kept. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a beginning. And sometimes that's enough.